Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Left Lens. Thank you for joining me tonight. As you can see, I have a very special guest here. It is Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector, former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer, a frequent author, and now a commentator on all things about the Ukraine crisis and much more. So, Scott, thanks so much for coming back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get right to it then. And while you're watching, make sure that you're liking this video, sharing it, and doing all that good stuff. So let's get right to it then. So, the last few weeks, when it comes to this conflict between Russia, Ukraine, of course, this proxy war that NATO is fueling and leading, so much has happened. It's been like a flurry of developments. And so, given all that's happened, we had the partial mobilization by Russia, then we had these referendums, we had also the Nord Stream pipeline explosions, the sabotage. We've had so many things going. We had just in the last few days, Ukraine try to fast track itself into NATO, and the United States kind of pulling back and saying, wait a minute, not so fast. Given where we're at, given now that there are 20 plus percent, was it 25, 30% of Ukraine is now Russian, is now a part of the Russian Federation. Given all that's changed in the last couple of weeks alone, where are we in this conflict? I'll let you take it from there.
Well, we're in a transformative moment in every sense of the word. Let's back up just a second and, how did we get here? And I'm not going to go through the whole history of the special military operation, but I will say that back in May of this year, when the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act authorizing some $43 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to be used to fund, underwrite, not just the Ukrainian military, but the Ukrainian state, basically, providing a lifeline to the Ukrainian state. And this was matched by NATO countries providing heavy equipment, et cetera. I call it a game-changing event. And I got a lot of pushback from people. They're like, oh, you're flip-flopping. It's a great switcheroo. You were so pro-Russia. And I'm not pro-Russia. I'm pro-fact. I'm pro, solid analysis. And, the fact is, when Russia initiated the special military operation, they brought in a finite number of military resources for a very specific military problem, which was the liberation of the Donbass, the Donetsk and the Lugansk People's Republic. That included creating a land bridge from Crimea through Kherson, Zaporizhia. It included other supporting military actions to fix Ukrainian forces in place, et cetera. But still, a limited number of people for a limited problem. By infusing tens of billions of dollars worth of hardware, Ukraine and NATO and the United States literally changed the game. It no longer was a struggle between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. It became the struggle between the Russian military and a NATO proxy. Now, simply saying you're going to provide equipment and actually having that equipment received, have the Ukrainians train on it, organize it into operational units and bring those units to the battlefield, there's a time gap. So calling it a game-changing event and actually having the game change took time. The game changed sometime in August when Ukraine started to receive these units, these reconstituted NATO units, even though they're Ukrainian manned, they're de facto NATO proxies. And then they deployed them, and starting on or about September 1st, they began this counteroffensive against the Russians. And this is where the inadequacy of the Russian force structure came into being. You have a front of 1,000 kilometers. You have 200,000 troops allocated for this task. That's 200 men per kilometer. That's not that many. But you can't just have them all up in the front online. You have to actually, have troops in the rear, in the depth, doing other things. So the bottom line is you actually had about 30 to 60 men per kilometer for the Russians. This is not doctrinal. This is not ideal. And the Ukrainians, using intelligence information provided by NATO, were able to find the seams, the weak spots in the Russian defense and exploit them. And once they punched through the defense, there was nothing in the rear to stop them. And they were able to gobble up a whole bunch of territory, especially up north in Kharkov. I think Russia woke up at that point and said, we have a problem. We have forces that are inadequate for this new reality, that this NATO army that's been assembled by Ukraine has the tactical and operational advantage. And if we don't do something, they'll get the strategic advantage, meaning they're going to change the entire narrative of this conflict. So Russia made two decisions. One was to initiate partial mobilization, that is to bring in 300,000 troops, all of whom have combat experience or prior military experience, and to organize them into units that will be brought to the theater of operations and supplement and reinforce the existing force structure, taking it basically from around 200,000 to 500,000. This is a significant thing. But the other thing was, if NATO is going to have a game-changing moment, Russia just changed the game, and the way they did that was by holding referendum. And they immediately turned this conflict from one where these NATO proxies were fighting Russian forces on Ukrainian soil, and they turned it into one where NATO proxies are fighting Russians on Russian soil. And that's a totally different thing. Russia just turned this conflict into one of an existential nature for them. They're defending the motherland, defending the homeland. This means that Russia's coming in with a completely different mindset. This is about the survival of a nation. It means that Russia can't lose, simply can't lose this. They can't afford to lose this, so they won't lose. Russia will do whatever's necessary to win. NATO, on the other hand, this isn't an existential crisis for NATO. NATO doesn't have an obligation to commit suicide for Ukraine, but NATO has overcommitted itself. They've made it too many political promises. They've provided significant, contributions, and so NATO is sort of in what I call the horns of a dilemma. No matter what they do, they're going to get impaled. If they go left, they get impaled. They go right, they get impaled. There's no easy solution at this. If you go right and continue to provide this equipment, it becomes a NATO conflict against Russia. And that has the danger of expanding the scope and scale of this conflict so that two nuclear powers are facing off, and the increases the probability of using nuclear weapons. Clearly, NATO doesn't want that. We saw when Zelensky made his emergency application for accelerated membership of NATO, both NATO and the United States went, well, no, not so fast. We don't want to have any part of that, because they know what it means. Zelensky was basically asking NATO to commit suicide. And what do I mean by that? Zelensky knows that he's at war with Russia. Zelensky knows that there was a referenda, and that from a constitutional law perspective, the Russians view the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk as being Russia now. So if Zelensky and Ukraine join NATO, NATO will be at war with Russia on day one. And what will happen then is that NATO will cease to exist, because Russia will launch nuclear weapons and destroy all of NATO. Russia is not going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Ukraine does not pose an existential threat to Russia. NATO intervening in Ukraine for the purpose of seizing Mother Russia, which now Kherson, Crimea, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Lugansk, they're now Mother Russia. So now this is about people coming in and trying to seize Mother Russia. That's as if somebody came to the United States, said, I'm not at war with America, but I'm just going to take Florida. I think the United States would say, no, you're not. We're going to fight to the death over Florida. We'll fight to the death over Maine. We'll fight to the death over any part that is the United States. And that's what Russia's going to do. They're going to fight to the death for Russia. So for NATO, now they're not willing to commit suicide. That became apparent. What NATO is going to do, however, can they just dump Ukraine? Remember, they just dumped Afghanistan last year. Are they going to dump Ukraine? That's the other horn of the dilemma. So NATO is going to try and find the middle ground, which is equally bad a solution. That is to continue to provide military hardware, financial assistance, to empower the Ukrainians to do whatever Ukraine needs to do, but keep NATO out of the conflict. It's that while this may be a proxy conflict, NATO itself is not going to get involved in this conflict. This means that a couple things. Tens of thousands of more Ukrainians are condemned to death because of this decision. And I think people need to reflect on that. That anybody who says we need to support Ukraine, you're literally saying we need to support the continued slaughter of Ukrainian soldiers. In this counteroffensive that Ukraine has run, the Ukrainians themselves have acknowledged over 20,000 casualties. In Ukrainian civilians are going to die. Not only that, this conflict will probably expand to the point where Russia will be compelled to take more territories: Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, Kharkov. That means that Ukraine will not just lose the 20% they already have, they probably will lose another 20%. So they could lose 40, 50% of their country before this is done. It means the death of Ukraine, the end of Ukraine. That's what NATO's done. NATO is sacrificing the Ukrainian nation for their own pride, for their own hubris. At the end of the day, Ukraine is going to lose. That's a reality, and Russia has changed. It's right now things look difficult for the Russians because no matter how we cut the pie, they still only have 30 to 60 guys per kilometer of frontage. They're trying their best right now to consolidate their defenses, to increase the number of troops, to make sure there's interlocking defenses, et cetera. But until they get the 300,000 people mobilized, there's a problem. But let's talk about the 300,000 for a second. A lot of people are saying, they're going to be poorly trained troops. These aren't the elite. They're not going to be able to do what the regular troops do. I disagree 100%. First of all, they all have military experience. They've all served before. But let's just reflect on American history for a second. A guy named Rick Atkinson wrote a trilogy about the history of the United States Army in the Second World War. And it's interesting. He talks about the failures of the Army early on, the Battle of Kasserine Pass in North Africa, how we had to replace a failed general, Fredericks, with this new general whose name was George Patton. Patton sort of transformed the Army, and the Army transformed with him. It became, by 1945, one of the largest armies in the world. It was the most professional military force that was almost exclusively manned by amateurs. What I mean is that people didn't sign up to make the military their profession. They were drafted, brought in to do a job, win the war, and then come home. And they were very, very good at what they did. I think these 300,000 are cut from that same piece of cloth. These are men who had already served their nation. They're men who willingly were mobilized, willingly went off to the training, but they want to go home to their families, to their jobs, to the lives that they had that were outside of the military. And they know that the quickest way home is to get the job done, accomplish the mission. So these 300,000 are going to be singularly focused on one thing and one thing only, and that's winning this war. That makes them very, very dangerous. I think anybody who minimizes the impact that these 300,000 have just don't understand, how mobilizations in times like this work. Again, I bring up the American model. I think the Russians are going to have their own version of that. 300,000 citizen soldiers who are going to become very professional, very quick, and very focused on winning this conflict. So people need to reflect on that. I think you're muted.
Yes, sorry about that. I wanted to get your reaction to directly after September 30th, directly after the referendums, the results came in. There was a celebration in Russia over the results, and Vladimir Putin gave a really, what I think, a historic speech in response. I want to get your reaction. What was your reaction to that speech, its significance moving forward? I mean, there was a lot of history there. There was a lot of just very firm statements and assertions of sovereignty, and a lot of what you've already spoken about. But I would like to get your reaction on Vladimir Putin's, what I think was a historic speech directly after the referendum results.
Yeah, and I might be wrong with the year here. I'm thinking 1946, but I could be wrong. Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri, that has gone down in history as the Iron Curtain speech. And basically, that speech defined East-West relationships for decades. It was that level of a speech. That the history that he brought into that, the power of his rhetoric, and the implications of what he said, and how that speech actually served as a foundation for what happened after that. This speech given by Putin will go down in history as important or more important than the Iron Curtain speech. Vladimir Putin has redefined relations between the West and Russia. He has set down a version of history that, while people may challenge it, nitpick it here and there, it doesn't matter. It's a version of history that has been encapsulated, and life has been breathed into it by the importance of the moment. And it's this version of history that's going to dominate Russian relations with the world going forward. Whether you agree with it or not, it's the version that is going to serve as the starting point. It was very firm in defining what Russia is, who Russians are, what they're not going to be, and what they're going to do. It is literally one of the defining moments of modern history. I think this speech, 100 years from now, will be viewed as probably the most important speech of this century. It's definitely the most important speech made by anybody so far this century, and I don't think there's going to be other moments like this, because this is earth-shattering. This is groundbreaking. This is game-changing. Whatever euphemism you want to use, you can add it to this speech, and it is. We in the West appear to be a little ignorant of this. We aren't paying as much attention to this speech as we should, but we will. Europe's going to. I think Europe's going to be paying a lot of attention to it this winter as they freeze to death, as their economy collapses, as their societies get shredded, not by anything Russia did, but everything they did. They're going to understand the context of which Putin has spoke. And I think the United States will wake up as we become more and more isolated in the world. We reflect on not only the strength of what Putin said, but the accuracy of what Putin said regarding America's role in the world today. No, this is first of all, it was a brilliant piece of rhetoric, political rhetoric. Political scientists should be poring over these words, and this was very carefully scripted. Every word had meaning. I had a Russian diplomat tell me once. He said, "Scott, you got to be careful what you say, because words have meaning. Words mean something. And so when you speak and you say words, you can't just throw words out there and then walk away as if they don't matter. They matter. Words matter." And every word spoken by Putin in this speech mattered. And that's why people need to study the speech and not be dismissive of it. There's one Western leader, a former Western leader, who finally gets it. Her name is Angela Merkel. And after the speech, she said, the world would do well to listen to what Putin has said, and respect it and act on it, because he doesn't bluff. So there's no bluffing, there's no posturing, there's no artifice here. This is all genuine reality that is going to define how Russia moves going forward. So if I were the Ukrainians, I would have listened to that speech and just gone into an outright panic, which of course they did, which is why they were looking for instant admission into NATO, because for them, that's the only thing that's going to save them. It's not going to happen. Ukraine is doomed as a nation state. I don't think this conflict ends with Ukraine existing. And again, that's sort of what Putin said. When the Russian president says that all the goals and objectives of the special military operation are in play and they will be accomplished in full, that means denazification. How do you define denazification? Well, Putin just defined it. He called the regime in Kiev a Nazi regime. So denazification means regime change. The Russians have now committed formally to regime change. Demilitarization means eliminating all of the NATO influence. Putin has said that Russia is now at war with the collective West. So the Ukrainian military is, in the eyes of Russia, NATO. It must be eliminated. So I think the speech made clear what's going to happen to Ukraine and what Russia's goals and objectives are. People just need to read it and understand it and not pretend it didn't happen.
Indeed, when I was covering it, here on this channel, reading it over, I mean, it was a history lesson too. I've heard you say many times, I've said it many times on this channel, that Americans, people in the United States, don't have a good grasp of history, don't understand their history, don't understand the contemporary reality, U.S. role in the world. This speech has both of those things, and so yes, I think everyone should study it. Now, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned Europe freezing to death. Today it was announced that the EU has signed on to a formal price cap of Russian energy. And this comes after the disastrous, which I've heard you speak about as well, the disastrous sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. And of course, right, Russia is being blamed for this. And a lot of the world believes that the United States, NATO, had something to do with it. Could you go over the problem here? Like, what is the significance of this pipeline, these pipelines being basically taken out? What are your thoughts about that situation? And then the consequences ongoing, because this is a development that's been happening for several months now. During this special military operation, the EU has been kind of the US's poodle, the US's servant in a lot of ways. And the situation is very grim. So could you talk about that? Maybe I would love to get your thoughts about it.
Well, let's just start off with, again, first principles here. The EU, the United States, NATO, the G7, they're all the same thing. They're all wrapped in the same cloak of basically working solely for the benefit of the singular American hegemony. So America is dictating policies and such. They have collectively denigrated Russia as being little more than a gas station disguised as a country. Okay, I mean, first of all, it's wrong, but let's just play the cute little game. If you're going to call Russia a gas station, then you should at least respect them as a gas station, especially when you're an automobile and that's the only gas station around. And if you want to start cutting yourself off, sanctioning the gas station, you're going to find yourself in the middle of nowhere on a 4-lane highway with an empty tank and nowhere to go. And that's where Europe is right now. The hubris of Europe to think that they can put a price cap on Russian energy, it's just ridiculous. It's going to backfire. These are people who've already dug the deepest hole possible, and they're just continuing to dig the hole deeper. The only solution for Europe was to go back to Russian energy. That was the only solution. There's no other option out there. There's nothing viable that's going to save them from this. And that's what happened with why the United States struck Nord Stream. And I'll tell you why I believe it. Well, first of all, let's just talk about that for a second. There are people sitting in jails around the world who have been convicted on circumstantial evidence that is weaker than the circumstantial evidence that we have regarding America's role in striking the Nord Stream pipelines. First of all, we have a clear statement of intent from the President of the United States himself, who said that if Russian tanks cross into Ukraine, he will shut down Nord Stream 2. It will stop functioning. That's the intent. Then we have a clear statement of motive from Secretary of State Blinken, who said, oh, well, it's too bad he got shut down, but this is a great opportunity. We should view this as a wonderful opportunity, a chance to do things that we always said we wanted to do. And he's supported by statements made by Victoria Nuland, by Condoleezza Rice. So we know that there's been motive. It's not just a crime of passion. This is a crime that's been considered for some time. It's premeditated murder, is what it is. So there's motive for premeditation. And then we have the means. You know, the U.S. Navy holding exercises right over the spot where the attacks occurred. Underwater exercises using the very technology that would be needed to do this. So I could indict the United States and I could win at trial because there's not a jury out there that would say, nah. I think really the nation that built the pipeline did it. The nation that benefits from the pipeline's existence did it. And remember, how does it benefit from the existence? You say, well, it didn't pump. It's not pumping gas. I mean, the Russians, maybe they wanted to, stop well, they already did. It's called an on-off switch. If Russia doesn't want to have gas flowing to Europe, they hit the off switch. But Russia wants gas flowing. How do we know? The Russians said, we want to sell you gas. We want to have Nord Stream 2 up and running. And what was happening? The German people, angered by the policies of their government, were going to the streets and they were starting to demand that their governments turn on Nord Stream 2. And any democracy where you have the people demanding something, a politician that fails to comply with the demands tends to get voted out of office, removed from office. And German politicians were starting to make noises as maybe we need to do something here. So what did the United States do? Took the decision out of their hands. Pop, 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 pop. No more Nord Stream 2, no more Nord Stream 1. So even if the German government wanted to turn on the pipeline, they can't. And that's what the United States did here. They did it. Now, I think this is just going to make matters worse for Germany right now because Germany literally has no options now. There's nothing they can do. The United States can't provide enough liquid natural gas to compensate. Germany can't afford the prices that will be charged for this. So Germany's doomed, literally doomed. Their economy is going to shut down. Hundreds, if not thousands of people are going to die this winter, die from exposure. And who's to blame? The United States, 110%. It's the Americans' fault. And the sad thing is, all of Europe knows it. This isn't a secret. All of Europe, even in the United States, where we pretend, the Russians did. Well, Michael Rubin just wrote an article in the National Interest where he said, hey, maybe Biden should do to Turk Stream, the Turkish pipeline that feeds gas into Southern Europe, what he did to Nord Stream 2. He doesn't say what he did, but we know what he means. Blow it up. He said Biden. So he clearly said Biden shut down Nord Stream 2. Biden did it. Well, why? Because Biden said he was going to do it. But now we're talking about attacking the Turks. We declared war on Europe. That's just a statement of fact. We declared war on Europe. We destroyed a $12 billion piece of European energy infrastructure. We have condemned the German economy to collapse, a collapse that hasn't been seen since the end of the Second World War. We're responsible. Right now, the German political and economic elites aren't willing to divorce America. They can't. They're like an abused spouse. They just keep coming back for more. But over the course of this winter, I think you're going to see these political elites removed from office. I think you're going to see these economic elites becoming irrelevant because you're not too elite of an economist when your economy is collapsing. And they're going to be replaced by new power structures that will be more inclined to view the United States as the problem and Russia as the solution. So I believe in the long term, this will backfire dramatically for the United States, that there's no way the United States walks away from this unscathed, because right now, the damage to Germany is still theoretical. At some point in time, it becomes reality, and that reality brings with it a political consequence.
Yeah, indeed. And, we see the propaganda mill really working hard right now, the U.S. and Western mainstream media propaganda mill working hard, the foreign policy establishment working hard to project onto Russia all of the qualities that you've mentioned, whether it's the economic crisis or really the deleterious military situation that Ukraine finds itself in, and by extension, NATO. I wanted to ask you, though, about this nuclear threat, because we've heard over the past several weeks Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons. Vladimir Putin isn't bluffing. There very well could be nuclear weapons. Oh no, we just saw a convoy moving with nuclear weapons. He could use them at any minute. You know, like what is the one? What is the? I know you have a pretty hard deadline to be out of here in about 20 minutes. So I would love to get your opinion about what is the reality of the sort of nuclear posture right now that we're hearing so much about. And given how hot the situation really is, because I think there is some reality behind the actual intensity of the conflict between, especially between Russia and NATO, you know, what happens from here? You know, now that you've kind of outlined all of the developments and that we've talked about thus far.
Look, when Vladimir Putin initiated the special military operation back in February of this year, he made it clear that if NATO intervened, that Russia would respond with all of the means available to it. And the assumption there was that this included the Russia's nuclear arsenal. But it also meant that Russia would respond with considerable non-nuclear conventional capabilities that hadn't materialized, and still haven't materialized. So it wasn't exclusively nuclear. What he's saying, though, is that for NATO to come into Ukraine and interfere with what Russia was doing would put NATO in direct conflict with Russia, and that Russia would do whatever it needed to do to ensure it didn't lose that conflict. So he's putting NATO on notice. He's done the same thing here by saying that if NATO, because literally by changing this conflict, by holding the referendum, by mobilizing 300,000, he guaranteed that if all things stay the same, Ukraine is going to be defeated. The only way Ukraine could survive is if NATO got involved. So he said Russia will use all the means available to defend Mother Russia. This includes nuclear weapons. But the Russians have also been clear to say, we have a doctrine. It's a published doctrine. And there's only two circumstances under which we use nuclear weapons. One is if you attack us with nuclear weapons, we respond with nuclear weapons. The other is if there's a conventional threat to Russia that threatens the existence of the Russian state itself, then we use nuclear weapons to counter that threat. Ukraine, in and of itself, does not constitute such a threat. Ukraine can't win this war. Ukraine can't threaten Mother Russia, not in the long term. NATO could, and so that's why Putin said this. But the doctrine would require NATO to intervene and then invade Mother Russia and seek to seize territories away from Russia. If NATO is not going to do that, then there's literally no threat of nuclear conflict, none whatsoever. But here's the problem. How did Joe Biden respond? First of all, Joe Biden makes up the threat. Russia is going to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Russia is not going to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. It's going to happen. But in the West, we've created this threat. And then we turn around and we communicate to Russia, if you use nuclear weapons, we will respond decisively. It'll be catastrophic for you, but it'll be non-nuclear. We're not going to use nuclear weapons in response. It's all going to be a non-nuclear response. And there's some in Russia that went, why wouldn't they use nukes? That might mean that if we nuke NATO, the United States won't respond because the United States is scared of our strategic nuclear deterrent. And so there's some in Russia right now who are starting to think, So if NATO gets involved, we could nuke NATO and get away with it. The United States would back down. And that's ignorance on the part of the Russians, because the United States nuclear doctrine, which is also published, clearly states that if nuclear weapons are used against the United States or its allies, that the United States will use nuclear weapons in response. So this is the danger. On the surface, there's literally zero risk of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. Why? Because it could only happen if NATO were to intervene in a way that empowered Ukraine and the NATO forces to strip away lands belonging to Mother Russia. Both the United States and NATO said, we don't want anything to do with that. We're not going to do that. Boom. So that pretty much takes that off the table. But now you've created a potential where people are not embracing what all five permanent nuclear powers embraced at the beginning of the year. You remember there was a joint statement where they said nuclear wars can't be won, therefore they should never be fought, and that we should all work to ensure that nuclear wars are never fought. Now you have people on both sides saying, we could win a tactical nuclear war. We could win that. We could bluff them. We could, escalate and force them to de-escalate. And you have people thinking the most insane thing in the world, which is to use nuclear weapons. There is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Any nuclear conflict will turn into a general nuclear exchange at some point in time, which means the world ends. I don't lose sleep thinking that Russia is going to nuke Ukraine. I do lose sleep that there are people on both sides of this equation who are considering the potential of winning a limited nuclear conflict. And this is very dangerous, very, very dangerous. And all it takes is one miscalculation. All it takes is somebody in Russia to decide that NATO has gone beyond simply providing arms. For instance, that some people could say that there's a feeling that the Ukrainian army that's fighting right now is supplemented by Western mercenaries in such quantities that they could constitute a de facto NATO military presence. There's also a feeling that many of the troops fighting for some of these Ukrainian formations are actually Polish troops, which now makes what's going on NATO. And if the Ukrainians continue to win on the battlefield and start seizing territories that are now Russia, this could spin out of control very quickly. So, on the one hand, there's no reason for nuclear war to be fought because the conditions shouldn't exist. On the other hand, because both sides appear to be misinformed about what the nuclear doctrine of the other side is, some things are being talked about that should never be talked about.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you one last question before you need to head out, and I will be sticking around, everyone, for another half hour, 45 minutes to cover a few other stories. But this last question I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned it earlier when you were speaking, you said that Russia cannot lose the war, will not lose this war. And so I'm wondering if you had contemplated, because we have people like Elon Musk contemplating what an end to this war would look like. He's on Twitter talking about what he believes, a UN kind of oversight over new referendums in the Donbass. He also talked about a neutrality, right? That Ukraine would submit and surrender to some kind of agreement to remain neutral, and NATO would, of course, go along with that. Now, what is your idea in terms of your thoughts about what would victory look like for Russia if that's indeed where we're going?
Well, we have to look at it from the big picture. Before there was a special military operation in Ukraine, there was December 17th, 2021, where Russia provided NATO and the United States with a draft treaty that described the conditions for a new European security framework. Russia basically said that it could no longer tolerate the expansion of NATO up to its borders. It could no longer tolerate the forward deployment of NATO forces along its borders, in that it now needed to have a new European security framework that put restrictions, binding restrictions on both parties, not just Russia dictating to the West, but Russia responding to the concerns of the West as well. This was dismissed by both NATO and the United States, which helped lead to one of the precursors for the current conflict. Russia hasn't backed down. That's still their ultimate objective, is to achieve a new European security framework. Now, a couple things have to occur in that. One, you need total victory in Ukraine, not partial victory, because Russia can't dictate a restructuring of European security framework if there's still a Nazi regime in Ukraine using NATO weapons to bleed Russia dry. That's not good. So Russia's going to have total victory, and I'll get to that in a second. But Russia also needs to have a Europe that's willing to enter these negotiations, and that's not going to happen so long as Europe is totally beholden to the United States. But I believe, because of the failed policies imposed on Europe by the United States, that there's going to be revolutionary transformation in many parts of Europe this winter, and that the Europe that emerges from this winter will be far different than the Europe that enters this winter. And it will be a Europe that might be more inclined to consider a new European security framework. And one of the reasons is because the political structures right now that serve as an impediment to this, NATO, the EU, G7, are all, there's no unity there. I mean, Biden can talk all he wants about unity. There's no unity. NATO's at war with itself. I mean, what do you say when the Poles say the Germans owe us $1 trillion in reparations, and the Germans say, really, we might take Silesia back from you? That's not unity. When the Turks are ready to go to war with the Greeks over the Aegean Islands, and France is ready to side with Greece against Turkey, that's, NATO's more in danger of going to war with itself than it is of going to war with Russia. The European Union, you just had Giorgia Meloni, elected Prime Minister of Italy, and she has basically called the European Union, trash, called the Euro trash. She wants to divorce Italy from this. And what happens when the German economy collapses? The foundation of the Eurozone is gone. Can the Eurozone survive? As more nations seek to rally around issues of national sovereignty as opposed to European collectiveness, the EU collapses. The G7 is supposed to be the 7 most influential economies in the world. They're not that influential anymore. They're going to become less influential once this winter's finished. So politically, these structures are gone, and I think Russia is going to be in a position to successfully negotiate a new European security framework with post-conflict Europe. But a prerequisite to that is winning this war. What does winning look like? I think winning looks like the following: Russian troops advancing all the way up to Ukraine's borders with NATO. That means the total destruction of the Ukrainian military and the total elimination of the Ukrainian government and the various governing structures in Ukraine, to purge them of the ideology of Stepan Bandera, that Ukrainian ultra-nationalist, Nazi-loving, murderous thug who's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Poles, hundreds of thousands of Russians, who currently is the national hero of Ukraine, and has streets named in his honor, statues erected in his memory. This has to be purged, eliminated from it. That's what denazification means. This means that Ukraine will cease to exist as a modern nation state, and that whatever Ukraine looks like once this conflict ends, it won't be the Ukraine when this conflict started. It won't be the Ukraine today. I think Russia will take even more territory, but it will be a total victory of Russia over Ukraine, a victory that sends a signal to every nation in Europe that war is not the answer, that if you go to war with Russia, this is what happens to you. And I think the Russian victory has to be that complete, and that's what Russia's moving towards. Vladimir Putin hinted at this in his speech, and the mobilization of 300,000 troops, combined with there's an additional mobilization of 70,000 volunteers undergoing right way. So it's not 300,000; it's 370,000, probably closer to 450,000 by the time all the volunteers get processed. These troops combined with the 200,000 give Russia more than enough military capacity to do this. I think Russia is going to be unleashing a strategic air campaign that hasn't existed yet, that is going to shut Ukraine down, destroy it economically, make movement almost impossible. If Zelensky doesn't die from bombing, he's going to be forced into hiding. He won't have the ability to communicate freely with the rest of the world. All of this is about to happen. And when it does, it'll point to a total victory of Russia on the battlefield, the elimination of Ukraine as a modern nation state, and a post-economic crisis Europe that has been transformed through its own internal revolutionary processes to empower a new class of political and economic elites who will be more inclined to work with Russia, less inclined to do the bidding of the United States.
Wow. Well, there's a lot to look forward to then. It sounds like. Well, with that said, Scott, I know that you do have to go for an appointment, an interview coming up next at 10 for yourself. So I really do appreciate you coming on this program. As things develop, I'm sure I'll be calling on you to help understand these developments in terms of this conflict, economically, especially militarily and politically. So thanks again so much, Scott. Everyone, make sure you stick around for the stories to come. But take care, Scott, and I'll be in touch.
Okay, thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, everyone. So that was a really great interview. Yeah, definitely stick around because I have a bunch of stories I want to cover. For those who are new to the program, of course, make sure you're subscribing to this channel. Make sure that you're hitting that notifications bell. You can become a member on YouTube to support this work. I'm trying to become sustainable. So becoming a member on the YouTube channel or becoming a member on Patreon. That's patreon.com/DannyHaiFong. I need about 100, I think it's about $130 or so per month to be sustainable, to make sure that all of the labor that's going into this helps keep everything going, from the technology to the updates to the labor, as well as just the basic day-to-day needs in this economic crisis. So please do find all those links in the description. But do stick around because I have all kinds of things to talk about. All right. Because we have some time here. I'll probably stay on for another 45 minutes or so. There's been a lot of developments. So these won't be Ukraine related. Scott really took care of that. All right. So there is first a few announcements. I am working on getting Dr. Mohammad Marandi on here to talk about Iran, but I do want to go over an Iran piece because, of course, there's been violent protests happening in the name of women's rights. And I want to go over an article that I found truly educational in Al Mayadeen on the U.S. roots, on the U.S.-backed meddling, the CIA meddling in these protests, facilitating and sparking what is looking to be, smelling, really shaping out to be a color revolution. So we're going to get to that in a minute. We'll also talk a little bit about, if we have time, I'll talk about the election. I'll give a reaction to the election results in Brazil, a very important election. But that will come afterward if there is time. But I definitely want to go over the Iran situation because this is something that's very frustrating for me, incredibly frustrating for me, because we've seen this playbook before so many times. You all remember the Arab Spring, right? The entire Arab Spring. While there were, of course, legitimate protests that happened in places like Tunisia and Egypt, what happened? you had imperialist forces in Egypt, and you had the Muslim Brotherhood. You had in Libya armed proxies of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States, um, Europe, flood Libya, overthrow the most prosperous country, the government of the most prosperous African country at that time, went from the poorest Libya in 1968. It was the poorest country on the African continent after the colonel-led revolution in Libya, 1969. There was massive transformation, nationalization of resources, and Libya became the richest country on the African continent with modernized infrastructure, free healthcare, free education, interest-free loans for things like cars, for things like higher education abroad. So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to U.S.-backed color revolutions in Iran also. Dating back 2009, the MEK, the Green Revolution, so-called, the Green Movement. These forces are completely sponsored and backed by the United States, by the CIA, and they are back again. They are involved in this. But this, unlike 2009, this uprising has become astroturfed with the branding of this is all about women's rights, right? And this is an issue that is something that can be exploited mightily in the West in the United States because, one, the West in the United States, the collective West, have a huge problem with women's rights, right? I mean, look at what we've just witnessed with Roe v. Wade and the inequalities that span so far in history. So there's a lot of projection going on. And also Iran has a history itself. It has a history, a very difficult one, where there's been a lot of instability. The years of the Shah were extremely insufferable, including for women. And then you've also had a real clash between Iran's Islamic law values, which are more socially progressive than, let's say, how Islamic law is applied in places like Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. But nonetheless, there is this clash between values, and there is a lot of hubris. And what I think Western civilizational racism projected onto Iran in order to portray it as this incredibly stifling, repressive environment because it is a Muslim majority country. So we need to talk about Iran from the perspective, number one, of it's a sovereign country with self-determination, with an independent government, a government critically important to the rise of a multipolar world, a government that has, since 1979, since the Iranian Revolution, improved the lives of everybody from those disastrous Shah years, improved the lives of everybody, and now is suffering from sanctions and the threat of war from the United States. So before I get to the article, I just want to say the number one duty and responsibility of leftists, of progressives, of revolutionaries, of anyone who cares about human rights in the United States is to first allow Iran to deal with its own problems. I don't want to see social media campaigns. I don't want to see you going on Twitter or Instagram and saying, oh, look at this Iranian royalist, this rich person sitting in the West saying how bad things in Iran are. No, do some research. Study what actually is going on in that country. Study what actually is happening geopolitically, because that will inform you about what are the actual aims and interests of this protest. And Al Mayadeen published an article recently that did a really good job following what it terms dirty money. Meet the U.S. agent driving the CIA-led riots in Iran. This is Ramona Issa, and it was published on the 28th of September in Al Mayadeen. The largest color revolution attempt in Iran's recent history is led by a woman on Washington's payroll, and we have the facts. So here we go. There are Iranian women, though a minority, who are not in favor of the mandatory veil, a legitimate grievance and opinionated dissatisfaction to which humankind is entitled. And then there are people leading a fraudulent anti-hijab movement with a barrel aimed at Tehran. So here's Masuma Masih, that's in quotes, Ahmadinejad Gomi. Meet Masih Ahmadinejad, Washington's weapon of choice for flaring up the largest color revolution in Iran today. Quote, I'm leading this movement, end quote. Ahmadinejad, 46, told the New Yorker on Saturday. The Iranian regime will be brought down by women. I believe this. Operating from an FBI safe house, Ahmadinejad has been living in the U.S. for the past decade, working as a full-timer for Voice of America Persia, Washington's propaganda mouthpiece funded directly by the Broadcasting Board of Governors, BBG, a soft power arm of the empire, fully funded by U.S. Congress, made to capitalize on harmful narratives in favor of Washington's corporatocracy. One note here, the Broadcasting Board of Governors is actually now called the U.S. Agency for Global Media. It's rebranded. The Broadcasting Board of Governors was once directly funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. Now it is U.S. It is funded by U.S. Congress. Okay, so it gets congressional funds, and it is deemed a kind of like NED, like think tank for the media. So Ahmadinejad's tasks are quite a few. To take cozy photographs with the world's most effective pro-war politicians who've only done everything to wipe out West Asia, such as Mike, quote, we lied, we cheated, we stole Pompeo. In Madeline, quote unquote, the price is worth it to kill Iraqi children, Albright. But that's not all. Between 2015 and 2022, the U.S. Agency for Global Media paid Ahmadinejad over $628,000 to harass veiled women, spew propaganda, and demand more sanctions against her country. Not a very patriotic thing to do. Ahmadinejad has been doing everything in her media power to isolate her country, attempting to render it a pariah state, banned from all diplomatic, economic, and political privileges in the global arena. Indeed, a champion of imperialism, Ahmadinejad is on a fat CIA payroll to incite violence and lies. And look at how much money she has received from the U.S. government, $628,000. The latest narrative exploited by Ahmadinejad is as such. 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in a CCTV footage gets in a verbal dispute with a female police officer over the way she wore her hijab wrapped around her head. There is no escalation for the dispute. The woman leaves the girl alone and walks away. In a matter of seconds, the young woman freezes, bends, and falls over in a chair to which bystanders ran to attend. The girl, who had underwent an open brain surgery in 2006, sustained a heart attack which put her in a coma. 2 days later, she was announced dead, after which Western tabloids accused Iranian police of beating Amini to death, leading to the riots. Admitting to lead the riots against the government is only a statement. Her tweets further expose her agenda. The transfer in a narrative from one tweet to the next is baffling. On September 14th, the day Amini suffered a heart attack, Ahmadinejad made no mention of beating and violence. She wrote on Twitter, quote, Amini suffers heart attack after being arrested by morality police, end quote. On September 15th, the CIA assets ramp up the rhetoric a notch. Quote, this woman is in a coma because morality police savagely arrested her, end quote. Still no mention of abuse, beatings, or physical violence. So here you see the tweet here by Ahmadinejad, where she doesn't mention beatings per se. So, and then you see here the tweet, suffers a heart attack after being arrested by morality police for wearing a hijab inappropriately. So, we see that the narrative has changed quite dramatically. And then between that tweet and a comment, Ahmadinejad caters to her bosses. Amini is in a coma after being beaten by morality police. And here you see the tweets where she is claiming that she was beaten. There you go, beaten. Yeah. So, and then again, you see she's talking about how she was beaten and fined in jail, or tens of thousands of women are being. But this is all about creating the narrative that she was brutally beaten in jail, which wasn't true. So on September 16th, the day the young woman was announced dead, Ahmadinejad launched a hashtag which she had been paving fertile grounds for. Mahsa was murdered by the hashtag Mahsa was murdered by the Islamic Republic's hijab police in Iran. So this is all within a matter of days where she is changing her narrative. Washington's lackeys were at work too. One of the first to accuse the police of beating Amini was Mazia Bahari, founded Iran Wire. Bahari was an anti-Tehran Iranian exile who has admitted to covering illegal demonstrations and helped promote color revolutions in Iran. He's an empire asset. The second Twitter post, which propagated the false narrative, was from Babak Takvahi, a double agent exile accused of disseminating sensitive information to the CIA and Mossad, a military contributor to Israel Hayom, Pentagon research reports, and U.S. State Department funded Radio Free Asia and Radio Liberty, which is also on the BBG, really the U.S. Agency for Global Media payroll. With hundreds of fake accounts which trended on social media, the tweets gained massive momentum. The riots were immediately stirred up. Terrorist groups among the crowds were detected and arrested, carrying sharp weapons and explosives. Killings were carried out with the aim to blame the government, and rioters burned banks and other state institutions, creating chaos. The MEK, mind you, has been a terrorist organization in the U.S. until being delisted in 2014, the year Ahmadinejad made her way to the United States. Now tabloids pair quote-unquote freedom-loving Iranians with MEK supporters and organizers. So here you have a tweet right here where it says freedom-loving Iranians and MEK supporters demonstrate in Toronto. So MEK, they're an armed group funded and backed by the United States. This is how obvious it is, right? This is what's going on. This is how obvious that there's U.S. meddling. And this is the principal contradiction the principal problem we need to be focusing on. Washington for long has tried to mobilize Iranians against their government, either through media propaganda or through sanctions. The chaos brewing is a dream come true for Ahmadinejad, a byproduct of decades of work. A WikiLeaks cables from 2009 sent to the U.S. State Department wrote about a dissatisfied Ahmadinejad complaining of a quote-unquote lack of cohesion among reformists, which was impeding Washington's plans and interests. Global media, Hillary Clinton, regime change, Soros' Open Society Foundation, and the National Endowment for Democracy have all simultaneously bandwagoned on the campaign, shedding crocodile tears for Iranian women. Mind you, these entities have projected, enabled, and funded the most brutal patriarchal policies against women around the world, including the U.S. There is no regard for Palestinian, Yemeni, Iraqi, Syrian, Libyan women when the U.S. either bombed or funded weaponry to bomb societies back into the Stone Age. Washington funds the most repressive entity in the West today, quote unquote Israel, whose system bases itself on racism, rape, and uprooting. Not to mention the sanctions which Ahmadinejad has repeatedly called for to be implemented against Iran, as she believes they work. Sanctions have affected the lifestyles of many Iranian women, impeding them from their right to sanitation, securing quality nutrition and health for their children, and utilizing resources for healthy living. It's not so feminist now, is it? So this article says that the hijab is a democratically voted and legitimized by law. Perhaps the corporate media's abuse of freedom is not leaving any space for us to investigate. Facts, when conveyed effectively, are an angry masses' great sedative. After Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's government was toppled in 1979, revolutionary leader Imam Khomeini held a nationwide referendum on which people voted whether or not they advocated for Iran to be ruled by an Islamic constitution. Within this context, Iranian women integrated the hijab into the constitution, and Iranian women have the right to revoke it if they want to. The law is a democratic decision made by the people and the women of Iran. Hence, the legitimacy of the law is still intact. The popular support for the law was reiterated in a 2014 national poll, which collected data from all provinces across the country, holding the question of whether they agree that the mandatory hijab should be implemented on Iranian women, even if they do not agree with it. Around 19% of the population completely agreed, 35% said they agreed, and 25% were neutral. In 2021, Iranian Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, Ali Motahari, suggested another referendum on the veil be conducted when protests again were on the rise, exhibiting the democratic values which the state holds as opposed to what the West paints the country to be, a clerical wasteland dictatorship. So the question here is, what is there to fight for when Iranian women themselves are in favor of the hijab by popular referendum and demonstration? Do the West and its blind followers want to save Iranian women from themselves? For a population widely familiar with Edward Said's Orientalism, this projection is quite embarrassing. So before I move on, I just want to say, this is a complex issue. The issue of gender, women's rights, patriarchy is a very complex issue. And for me, I look at this problem from where I sit in the context of the United States, where women's rights and rights for people uh, are divided and are stripped uh, because of these kind of inequalities. And so, while this is definitely not to say there aren't inequalities in Iran and a history of this is also to say that Iran has the right and Iranian people have the right to figure that out for themselves. My philosophy, my position always on these issues is the United States and the West have no right to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. And this includes their internal affairs on these kinds of issues. These are issues that the United States knows nothing about. Most Americans can't locate Iran on a map, let alone tell them how they should govern their country. And the same goes for the U.S. political class and the foreign policy establishment, which, unlike the vast majority of ordinary Americans who, if not all of ordinary people in the United States, the U.S. political class and the foreign policy establishment has the blood of Iranians on their hands, whether it's through overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 with the help of the CIA, installing the Shah, who then killed tens of thousands of Iranians, imprisoned many more, tortured many more. And then the United States slapped sanctions on Iran after the 1979 revolution, which have yet to cease. And those sanctions have only been tightened further and further. And this does not even mention how the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, right? I was in China when Qasem Soleimani was killed, and I can tell you that there was a lot of consternation about that. Even in China, there's a lot of worries about, oh, is this the United States about to start another war? But the United States already has blood, the Iranian people's blood on their hands. So the United States doesn't have a right to lecture Iran. Iran has the right to organize and resolve these issues as it sees fit. And so that needs to be the number one, I think, concern of people in the United States, because we have a problem here. We have a problem where the United States is not coming to the table, is not it's not instituting a new JCPOA agreement, a new nuclear deal. It's not doing anything to ease tensions and to make the lives of Iranians better. It's actually imposing even more suffering with the sanctions and with the threat of war. So the infiltration and disruption of a society, as we continue. In 2002, former Israeli PM Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held a 2.5-hour conference just before George Bush announced his invasion of Iraq, in which he called on the United States to foment regime change in Iran, offering an explanation on how to dismantle the anti-imperialist social fabric of the country. In his vision, Fox Broadcasting would air Beverly Hills 90210 and Melrose Place to Iranians through their televisions. This is pretty subversive stuff, he remarked. The kids of Iran would want the nice clothes they see on those shows. They would want swimming pools and fancy lifestyles. I mean, this is how debased the West, the United States, and this is how debased Israel is. The current riots in Iran are not an event suspended in time, but rather a continuation of years of disruption attempts by people like Ahmadinejad and Netanyahu. The very social fabric of the country is what kicked out Western greed in 1979, a fabric largely built on cultural affluence and appreciation for tradition brewed over the course of centuries. To shift that fabric would entail transforming the material conditions. Hedonism, pleasure, and materialism are weapons in a toolbox used to dumb down communities into virtual enslavement. Hollywood has proved itself to be one of the best tools to redefine the values of freedom, so effective that even Arab media have been throwing Western cultural projections onto Iranian women who are largely supportive of the mandatory bail. Hearts may be in the right direction, but not in the right place. Activists on social media have taken to advocate for the quote-unquote autonomy of Iranian women according to their standards and terms, regardless that it may not be consistent with their nature or of their state or society. If we truly want to help and support Iranian women, we must first bring our cultural projections to consciousness. Are we truly supporting their struggle, or are we just telling them how they should live their lives? For a society which is proud and emotionally attached to its culture, are we doing justice by following governmental-funded tabloids, attempting to dismantle the very fabric of an anti-imperialist society which has evolved so progressively? There isn't much predictability about when the fog of propaganda will clear up, so we can perceive matters free of manufactured anger that the media has managed to muster from millions. So I thought that was a good article. I'll put it in the chat for all of you. All right. Because I can see people asking for it. So this is an Al Mayadeen. And, I think this comes from a very particular perspective that's important because it's one that isn't being considered. And that is that, we have a problem when it comes to the definition of human rights, the definition of women's rights, the definition of what it means to be liberated from oppression. The class struggle and the anti-imperialist struggle in the West, in the United States, is at such a low point that the bourgeoisie has been allowed to wrestle hold of these very legitimate issues. Now, Iran, I'm not familiar with the internal fabric of Iran so much as I am about the United States. But over the course of history and over the development of certain kinds of societies, especially societies that were ruled over by U.S.-backed autocrats and like the Shah, Mr. Pahlavi, of course there are going to be inequalities based on issues such as these. The women's question, as us communists call it, but the question of women's rights. So I think the interesting point that this article makes for me, and that I want to promote, and I think should be the position of people in the United States and the West who are concerned about the way that Iran is talked about, given these riots, these demonstrations that have turned violent. Given that, I think what's important is that we remember that Iran, just like anywhere else in the world, has the right to exist how the people in those nations want to exist. And while, of course, social relations are going to be more complex than that, right? Because we can't just say that, oh, yeah, everyone has just the freedom to just decide and determine individually. No, this is a collective process, and it will be a struggle. If there are issues, it'll be a struggle that they have to carry out for themselves. The problem here is that the United States and NATO countries, the West, doesn't allow countries that challenge U.S. hegemony, that have a sovereign mentality, that fight for self-determination, and that fight for a more equitable world order. It doesn't allow those countries to exist. So Iran is on the regime change hit list, and the ongoing sanctions, the obvious military encirclement of Iran, the military bases everywhere, the U.S. invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, the U.S. relationship with Israel. We can go on and on and on. A lot of this is directed at Iran because Iran not only has a domestic economic and political model the United States doesn't like, but Iran now is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which Iran's joined not days before these protests began. And I said on social media, on Twitter, that I believe there was a connection. And I still do, because I think that Iran's increasingly, well, I don't even want to say increasingly. I think Iran's overall posture, its anti-imperialist worldview and orientation, as this article mentioned, is actually the principal threat. Iran is Syria's friend. It is Palestine's friend. It is the friend of all progressive nations around the world. It's a friend of Venezuela. It's a friend of Cuba. It's a friend of China. It's a friend of Russia. And actually, Iran's relationships with all of these countries has only strengthened because, well, Europe, of course, is subservient to the United States. And even though Europe didn't want to follow the sanctions on Iran, Europe is not a reliable friend to Iran. And the United States is an adversary, not of Iran's choosing. Iran certainly would like to come back to even some kind of Iran nuclear deal, some kind of nuclear deal. But as Mohammad Marandi has said on so many programs I've watched him on, and hopefully we'll have him on Sunday to talk about this as well, Iran doesn't want the same kind of deal it got in 2015 with the JCPOA. It wants a more robust, firm deal that says the sanctions are actually going to be lifted and that there's going to be some accountability structure on the side of the United States. Because if that's not the case, what happens? Well, the United States doesn't ever, the United States doesn't view international law or agreements or anything like that as anything that it is bound to respect. So that means that Iran cannot trust the United States to be a good faith actor, and thus we have a real, thawing in relations, and that's why we have and we see this attempt, which is an attempt at regime change. This is an attempt, this so-called protest movement, which I believe is a color revolution from all the evidence, from its leadership, from the violence that has been enacted, from the fact that you will see more security forces getting hurt and dying. It reminds me of the Hong Kong protests. It reminds me of so many other examples, Syria, Libya, where you start to see government forces start getting attacked and hurt more than the people. That's not generally how peaceful protests and demonstrations go. And I would know because I've participated in several in the United States where the exact opposite happens, where the police are coming after us, they're breaking us up. And if, we do anything that they deem to be a quote unquote threatening or against their wishes and interests, they arrest, beat down, and sometimes kill, right? Or disappear, as we saw in the 2020 protests, the George Floyd protest, Breonna Taylor protest, the protests against racist policing and mass incarceration. So, Iran has the right to defend itself. Iran has the right to self-determination. And this protest movement, right, even if there are legitimate grievances, even if there are legitimate problems, which, I'm not an expert. It sounds like, in this article, they talked about this being up for a vote, right? I'm not an expert on Iran's government and its internal structures. I'm much more familiar with places like China and Cuba. I could talk a lot about their internal government structures and how they enact their own kind of democracy, which they would call people's democracy and socialist democracy. But in Iran, I'm less familiar. But what I do know is that any issue, any problem that is going on in Iran is for the Iranian people to determine, to decide, to struggle over. And the United States needs to get the hell out. The CIA needs to get the hell out. They need to take their money. They need to pack their bags. They need to cease doing what they're doing. The sanctions need to end. The military encirclement, the campaign of regime change against Iran needs to end. That is the end of the story. And then we can see how Iranian society develops and emerges free of imperialism. We could apply this to so many different countries with varying degrees of ways of organizing the society based on rights for women and rights for ethnic minorities. We could go on and on human rights issues. For example, in Venezuela, Cuba, right? There's always talk about, human rights abuses, anti-democratic, all of this. Well, leave them alone. Leave these countries alone. And let's see how they flourish or not. Because it seems to me that a lot of societies, Iran included, actually have made incredible progress despite being under the gun and under immense pressure from U.S. imperialism. Iran's standard of living is way higher since 1979. Illiteracy has been basically wiped out. There is a robust social welfare system in Iran. And this is all despite the fact that it's relatively isolated in the global market. The same goes for Cuba. Cuba has made immense gains in human rights for all people, for Afro-Cubans, for women, for LGBTQ people. We could go on and on and on. And it also has a universal socialist economic base where you have free healthcare, free education. You have housing for everybody. I've been to Cuba, believe me. I was in the metropolis of Cuba, Havana, which is a pretty poor metropolis. It's a pretty poor capital, but because of the sanctions. But nonetheless, you don't see the homelessness. You don't see the tent cities. You don't see that because everybody has the right to their basic needs. And so even if incomes are lower because of the sanctions, people still are able to live. People are able to get by. And that is something that the United States has no respect for, right? Absolutely no respect for. So Iran has the right to determine these issues for itself. So Iran's self-determination needs to be respected. So I want to quickly comment on the Brazil election. Okay, and then I'll end the stream. So while you're here, make sure you're liking this video. Okay, I see that on YouTube we have 766 likes, but we still have 1,300 viewers. So let's get that up to 1,000 likes. So like the video, get it up to 1,000 likes, and also be sure leave a comment. You can support this channel by becoming a member. So that's an option for $5 per month, or better yet, subscribe on Patreon, because I'm not just on YouTube. I'm also a writer. I have an article coming out. I write for Black Agenda Report. I have an article coming out tomorrow on revolutionary optimism. I also have an article coming out in the Global Times, which is Chinese media. The Global Times will publish. I don't know when it will come out, but the article will be about why the CIA needs to be abolished. And this was a commissioned article. So if you believe that China is the Global Times is the tabloid or the so-called mouthpiece of the Communist Party of China, which I think is debatable. I think that there are elements to that. I think the Global Times definitely has a relationship with the People's Daily, which is the official, or at least the media that is most affiliated with the Communist Party of China. But if you, regardless of what you believe or what you think about it, they commissioned and asked me, hey, do you want to write about why the CIA should be abolished? We saw that you wrote that on Twitter, and could you elaborate on that? So that's pretty interesting. I don't think I've ever had even sources in the United States on the left or anywhere in anti-establishment news and analysis and reporting ask me that. Okay. So all of your support on Patreon. You can also subscribe annually on Substack. It's a great place to support me as well, in order to sustain this work. So I want to comment, and I think I'll try to read the report from the Global Times. It's quite a good report on the situation in Brazil. But as I'm pulling that up, I just want to say, I'm very pleased that it seems like Lula is on the way to victory. It's not for certain. It was a lot closer than I think a lot of people thought it was going to be based on polls. But from people I've been listening to, Convo Couch folks, I've been listening to I've been listening to folks who were there. They seem to be less surprised. And now I wanted to comment on why that may be. So there has been an incredible backlash. It's not talked about. A lot of it's been talked about as, oh, there's these contemporary issues. But I think we have to remember that Brazil has faced an incredible backlash against the leftist forces there. And Brazil is a very repressive police apparatus. It has and its oligarchy is very deeply embedded in the military state there. Right? It wasn't too long ago, 1960s, that Brazil had a fascist dictatorship. So Brazil has a very specific history, and Lula da Silva, right? He was imprisoned after he was president, of course, on false corruption charges. And Dilma Rousseff in 2014-15, she was overthrown in a judicial coup, which was also fraudulent. And that judicial coup put into place the mechanism from which Jair Bolsonaro won. So that apparatus is still in place. And we have seen Bolsonaro's forces in this election also do quite well in the Senate. And I think we should not underestimate the power of the oligarchy, of the media, the private media, and just the power that what I think Bolsonaro is, an extension of the military dictatorship and regime and the right-wing forces that seek to bring Brazil's poor into a permanent state of immiseration that only gets worse and worse. That's not been talked about. So I wanted to say that before getting into how the Global Times has covered it yesterday. So China says, this is the Chinese perspective here. China says Brazil to face deepening political polarization after tighter than expected first round election. Political polarization will continue to deepen and political violence is likely to happen during the following election. Chinese experts predicted as far-right incumbent Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and his leftist rival, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, are set for a runoff election at the end of the month after a tighter than expected first round. With fierce competition between the two candidates, tensions between supporters on both sides have risen. In his speech, Bolsonaro referred to his supporters as a quote-unquote army. Lula has received sporadic threats of attack since the election campaign kicked off in mid-August, and his campaign team has urged him to wear bulletproof vests at public events. Chinese experts warned that the January 6th U.S. Capitol Hill riot may repeat in Brazil, but the largest emerging country in the Southern Hemisphere is expected to maintain friendly and cooperative relations with China, especially economic cooperation, no matter which party comes to office, which is very important to China because now Brazil is part of BRICS, right? The financial alliance that seeks to create alternative currencies and financial structures to be more independent from the West. And Brazil really does need China's investment and China's trade. That is very true. But I will say this. I organize, I'm a co-editor with Friends of Socialist China, and we held an event where Dilma Rousseff spoke, and she spoke about China. And a prominent Chinese academic at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences also spoke. He taught in Shanghai, and he said that right away after her speech, he said, I can tell you that my colleagues and that most Chinese people I've spoken to about this matter want Lula to win this election. I mean, this event happened a few months ago, but nonetheless, I think it's very important to note. With 99.7% of electronic votes counted, Lula was ahead with 48.4% of the votes versus 43.3% for Bolsonaro. The National Election Authority reported Sunday night. Neither candidate won a majority, so the race will go to a second round on October 30th. Before Sunday's vote, several opinion surveys had shown that leftist Lula, who was a president from 2003 to 2010, led far-right Bolsonaro by 10 to 15 percentage points. The tight result dashed hopes for a quick resolution to a deeply polarized election in the world's fourth largest democracy, Reuters said. Unlike the overwhelming victory predicted by pollsters in the media, Lula only had a less than 5% lead over Bolsonaro, which means that Lula is not a sure win in the second round of the election, said Xu Xiqing, a research fellow at Latin American Studies at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, told the Global Times on Monday. During the less than a month's time remaining, both presidential candidates entering the final race will be doing their best to win voters over in the middle, Xu noted. Xu noted that the narrow gap between the two candidates in the first round of voting reflects a serious division in Brazil and will have a significant impact on the subsequent election, intensifying polarization and possibly generating political violence in the country. The expert noted that Brazil has a larger voting base and uses electronic counting. If Bolsonaro loses the election, his margin for victory over Lula is small. Bolsonaro may copy the path of former president of the United States, Donald Trump, and refuse to recognize the election results. There is a possibility Brazil could see the same version of the Capitol riot that followed the U.S. presidential election of 2020, Xu said. So, fears are also arising among analysts that the far-right Bolsonaro, who idolizes Trump, may refuse to accept the results if he loses, paving the way for a January 6th-style institutional breakdown in Latin America's biggest country, according to Reuters. So, that's a concern, okay? And now they're going to talk about the rare intensity of this election. It's a party rivalry, left-right confrontation, and following it, there's been threats, intimidation, political violence, which have grown, says experts, but it's a reflection of the inherent political contradictions in Brazil's society, its economy, and it's a microcosm of polarized politics in the context of COVID-19 and global turmoil. Experts at the UN expressed their concerns in September regarding the ongoing defamatory campaign and continued attacks against democratic institutions, such as the judiciary and the electoral system in Brazil, including the electronic electoral system. They called on Brazil's authority to protect and duly respect the work of electoral institutions. So Xu pointed out that Lula and Bolsonaro, who belong to different political camps, have many differences in their views. Lula's lead is partly due because of in the current vote share to his achievements in poverty alleviation during his years in office, said Xu. Xu noted that during his administration, Lula had proposed a zero hunger strategy aiming at gaining the support of many lower and middle class workers, while Bolsonaro supporters are mostly entrepreneurs, so business people. Lula opposed privatization and advocated more taxes on the rich, while Bolsonaro advocated privatization and pension reform. In foreign relations, Lula created the Union of South American Nations and supported Latin American integration, while during Bolsonaro's term, Brazil withdrew from there and suspended its participation in all these institutions. As the largest emerging country in the Southern Hemisphere, Brazil's political trends are regional wind vane. If Lula is elected, it will push the return of the left wing in the region, which will inevitably have an important impact on geopolitics in Latin America and the reconstruction of the international order, analysts pointed out. Before the Brazil election, the region already had seen a shift in political preference indicated by a surge in the election of left-wing leaders amid the economic and social crises aggravated by the pandemic. This includes Chile, Honduras, Peru, Bolivia, and have led to claims that Latin America is going through another pink tide, the political movement that saw the rise of left-wing leaders across the continent in the early 2000s, according to media reports. I also want to add Venezuela is stronger than ever. All right. So Venezuela is actually growing in Venezuela's popularity in terms of the Bolivarian movement, the Party for Socialism in Venezuela, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. The popularity is growing there as well. Several media in Nicaragua, we can't forget Nicaragua, the re-election of Daniel Ortega. So you have Argentina. Did they say Argentina here? No. So Argentina as well, even though there are contradictions there, but Argentina as well. Several media reports have predicted if Lula wins the election, it will mean a leftward shift in the political direction of Brazil after many years, as well as a clearer crescendo of the leftist wave in Latin America. So, that's about it. I don't want to go. So then it talks about China's relationship. Exports to Brazil from China, about 19 billion in the first quarter of 2022, 23% of Brazil's total imports. China's imports from Brazil totaled 19.7 billion, accounting for 29% of Brazil's total exports. So basically a quarter of Brazil's economy is reliant on China on average. So that's very important to note. And I think China does a really good report here, summarizing what the media has said. And I hope this is an education for maybe newcomers to this channel who don't know how I do things. I pay attention to media from China, from Russia, from all over, because I think we need to understand the perspective and also to demonstrate that actually the reporting is quite good and quite unbiased. Unlike in Western corporate media, we didn't see any demonization. Really, we saw statements about Bolsonaro. I don't think China wants to see Bolsonaro win, right? But we also saw that the rhetoric was still quite even and balanced, unlike in the United States where it's been an anti-Lula campaign. You have whole articles written in the Western corporate media in places like CNBC talking about why Lula shouldn't win, why he's terrible for Brazil, right? What right is it of the United States to even weigh in on that? The Western corporate media to weigh in on that when the United States' political system is a basket case that absolutely has no legitimacy, right? You have like 10% trust in Congress, less than 40% trust in the job that Joe Biden is doing. It seems like the United States has a lot of problems, not to mention its horrific electoral system that still discriminates based on a race, and also just constantly is being dictated by the rule of monopolies, banks, and big capital. So, my closing thoughts on this, okay, is that, I'm all in for Lula. And the reason I'm all in for Lula is because Lula represents a shift to the left. And that doesn't say that Lula is going to solve all the problems in Brazil. And there are many of those. Brazil also has a deep race issue. Afro-Brazilians, Brazilians of African descent, Brazilians of indigenous descent, the state of the Amazon, all of that. Those are really big and deep questions that are hard for a political movement like the PT to completely address because of its own internal contradictions, but also because Brazil's government is not necessarily being transformed. So even during Lula, there was great progress on poverty alleviation. And that's why I support Lula, because Lula is for the poor, he's for the working class. But there's still going to be contradictions in Brazil that aren't going to be resolved. And the political situation is going to be pretty tenuous in Brazil. That's just a reality that we just have to acknowledge. But we also have to take a side, I think, on this issue. Doesn't mean that we interfere in the process directly, but it does mean that there is really a polarized political line being drawn in this election. It's Bolsonaro, who represents capital, who represents the far right, the actual far right, not like some kind of horseshoe neoliberal theory, anything like that. Bolsonaro is the oligarchy, all right? And Lula is a representative of the workers. That's his roots. That's how he governed. And while Brazil's political situation is very complex, and there certainly isn't going to be some kind of revolutionary transformation in Brazil, it will represent a step forward. And regionally and internationally, it's so important because a victory for Lula is another hit to the U.S.'s Monroe Doctrine and its imperialist subversion and domination on this continent, South America, as well as around the world. Because Lula will no doubt reinstitute Brazil's leadership in an institution like BRICS, which Brazil was really influential in pushing for. He really did push for BRICS. And so, that kind of multilateralism, integration, and international solidarity and unity is what we need. And Lula will certainly bring forth that. It won't be complete. It won't be in entirety. He will have to govern in Brazil. And so some people I really respect, for example, Jemima Pierre has brought up the Haiti situation. And, others bring up how, Lula does balance, right, more moderate positions as well. And so, it may not be crystal clear perfection, as a lot of leftists in the United States really want. They want the purity, especially socialists, real socialists, not democratic socialists or whatever, but socialists who are for revolutionary transformation, who really want to see humanity liberated from oppression and exploitation, may have some problems with Lula, just like the entire project for integration has contradictions. But every movement is going to have contradictions. But what matters the most to me is how we act now to move forward from here. And I think what I see as important is championing and defending the forces that support Lula, because they are really on the front lines of trying to empower working class people and poor people in Brazil and elsewhere. And so, that's where I stand on this issue. And so I'll be looking closely toward the end of October as we approach Halloween. Hopefully, the situation in Brazil will be a little less frightening than it is now under Bolsonaro with a Lula victory. And hopefully that will empower leftist forces in Brazil, working class forces in Brazil, to continue to strengthen their resolve and their activity and their movement for social justice. So that's really what I'm hoping for, what I'm pulling for, and we shall see, because it's not a guarantee, not at all. It's not a guarantee. So with that said, everyone, let's see how we're doing with these likes. Oh, we're up to 936. Amazing. Can we get it up to 1,000? Can we get it up to 1,000? So now is the time of the program where I'm going to thank Super Chat. And then I think I'm going to head out. But before you go, make sure you do like this video. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the notifications bell. Make sure that you consider becoming a member either here on YouTube, or you can go to patreon.com/DannyHaiFong to support this channel. I am trying to raise about $140, $130 more per month this month, so that I can be sustainable make technology advances. I just moved. As you can see, there are some books on the ground here, things on the ground, just moved. So helping me get the place ready to have a little bit more quality, right? It's not a studio. I'm literally just sitting in my living area, but to kind of get it back to where it needs to be. All of that is helpful. All of your support is helpful. So I'm going to go to the super chats. They're buried here. So I'm just going to go from bottom to the top. Thank you to Taro Man Harris. Are you going to try to get the Duran on soon? Well, we've been conversing by email, and they're very busy people, I'm sure. So we haven't set a date again yet, but that is the plan, to reschedule and have them come back on here. And I'm sure there'll be different things to talk about, right? A lot of the things I talked to with Scott today, I wanted to ask them as well. But no, there will be no shortage. The Ukraine situation is moving very fast and rapidly, and it's changing all the time. So thank you, Big T, who's a moderator. They've said check out my link tree. That is all the links. It's in the show description. It's also in the channel banner on the profile. Thank you to Strian for the super sticker. I appreciate your support tonight. Let's keep going. We have a lot of trolls here. The chat had some trolls. That's interesting. I'm literally doing a YouTube stream, so people who say "shut your mouth," that's pretty hilarious. I gotta say, I appreciate the effort, the time spent. It takes a lot to spend your time trolling on YouTube channels. I don't know what that's about. I would hope that there was other outlets for you all to to express yourself, but hey, to each their own. You know, as long as you're liking the video, help the algorithm, bring on more trolls. Let's see. Thank you, Matthew, for the super sticker. I appreciate the supports. All right. Let's keep it up. Thank you to Donald. All right. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. That's colorful. See, that's what I'm talking about, that patriarchy, guys. See, I'm not gonna cancel you, but you gotta reflect on that. Now, I'm sure it's a joke. I'm sure whatever, but thank you for the super chat, Donald Trump. I won't say the other part of the name because for a lot of reasons. Let's see. Anything else? Any other super sticker, super chat? You can leave some. Still 1,300 people here watching. This is my most watched stream thus far. Incredible. So thank you to you all. I hope to see you around more. Okay, so that's why it's important to hit that notifications bell, subscribe. Make sure you subscribe here. You can go to Rockfin. You can subscribe to my Rockfin. All right. That's that's rockfin.com/DannyHaiFong. What am I saying? Rockfin.com/The Left Lens. All right. So look up The Left Lens on Rockfin. Thank you, David, for the super sticker as I make my way through here. Thank you, Felix, who said Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation demands that y'all smash the like button. Nice. Or Shahid 136, drones will find you. Indeed. So thank you, Felix, for that super chat. All right, let's see any others. Yeah, we got David again with the super stickers. Thanks for your support, David. Really appreciate it. This channel is growing. It's all because of people like you all. All right. So thank you so much. Keep hitting that, hitting the like button, doing all the good stuff, even if you're unable to subscribe on Patreon or on the channel. So here's David again with a $20 super sticker. Thank you so much for your generosity, David. I really appreciate you coming out here. Here is Chris Hemphill. I didn't get to your question, but he said, does Mr. Ritter think that the USA West may be setting up a false flag, possibly a nuclear one? Sorry, I didn't get to questions with Scott. He had to get off abruptly at 9:58. I wanted to be respectful, so I got him off 5 minutes earlier than that because he had a 10 o'clock. I had some technical issues, so I was trying to start 9 p.m. on the dot. You know me for my punctuality. Not a lot of channels do that. I have a theme song now, an introductory song that I'm going to try to play before stream so people can come on because that is more effective. That's how live streams work. I need to do that more, but I'm usually very punctual. But today, for some reason, StreamYard did not want to put my camera on, my mic on, so I had to restart my computer. It was ridiculous. But no, we didn't get to this question. And if you wanted my opinion about it, Chris, so thank you so much for the super chat. I don't know if they're a nuclear false flag. I think that there is an attempt right now to do any kind of sabotage and subversion of Russia that will spark what's happening, which is a permanent war. I do think that's happening. Do I think a nuclear false flag? I don't know if that seems to be, given how they reacted to Ukraine's NATO application, not in the cards. Now, damaging Nord Stream pipeline, that's a different thing. The Nord Stream pipelines, that's a different thing, right? Rather than create a new situation that kind of damages, that kind of creates more tensions, that damages key infrastructure, things like that, I see as more likely in the future because, right, this is all about keeping the war going, keeping the conflict going, and trying to wear down Russia. I don't think it'll work, but that's the hope. I think there really is a kind of Soviet Union, Afghanistan model here that I don't think is going to work because the United States it's not 1979 anymore. The CIA it can't do what it did in Russia. Can't do what it does. Can't do what it did in the Soviet Union like in Russia today. It's not the same situation. So, and Scott went over all of that, so I won't repeat. But basically, I do think that the United States and NATO want this to continue. Now, how far they want it to go, I think their actions may push it farther than they may even want it to go because you can't be neutral in a moving train. Howard Zinn taught us that. And I do believe that it is a big problem for NATO to be continuing to push and accelerate and militarize and support Ukraine in this way without any prospects for settlement and peace. I think that's the big issue, and that could very well lead to the unthinkable. Should NATO, for some reason, due to feeling compelled to, kind of just by the force of their own contradictions, moving in this direction, even if it's not the priority, you never know what can happen in this kind of military landscape, this imperialist landscape. You don't know what can happen. And so while I have a good amount of confidence that Russia will not be the one to spark something unthinkable, I do think that NATO's actions could very well do that. Do I think it'll be intentional? Not necessarily. Do I think it matters? Not necessarily. I do think that NATO's interests are for kind of permanent proxy war, which will, in their eyes, lead to a regime change scenario in Russia as part of the US's strategic competition or great power competition model, foreign policy doctrine, and as part of really what that foreign policy doctrine represents, which is Russia and China being the targets of the warfare state, because Russia and China are the new powers in the world that present a direct and fundamental threat to U.S. hegemony. Not in the ways that the United States, of course, in the West say they do. It's not because of the hacking. It's not because of all of this, the military. It's not all any of that. It's because Russia and China have a different vision. They have a different vision for the world. They have a different idea of where the world should go. They have a different idea about how relationships between nations should happen. And they also have a real vision for what it means for self-determination in the UN Charter to play a larger role in the political, economic, social, cultural development of the planet, ecological development of the planet, all of it, right? The United States doesn't want that. Monopoly capital doesn't want that. Finance capital definitely doesn't want that, right? Like these forces are only interested in profits, in domination, in anything that will feed the big capitalist elites that rule over their respective states. So anyway, folks, this was really good. This was a really good stream. Really appreciate all of your support. Appreciate you coming out to see Scott. Oh, I forgot a super chat here. I think this might have just come in from Laima Lisovska. Buy toilet paper while it's cheap. The EU sanctioned it. Ain't toilet paper ain't cheap in the United States right now. I gotta tell you that, Laima. I'll tell you this. Where I live, a decent roll of toilet paper, not, look, I'm not trying to wipe with one ply. I'm sorry. This ain't the airport for me. Like, I am going to spend more for more than one ply. Call me privileged, but I'm not a one ply guy. All right. So I buy the 2-ply, and I can't find any that's less than, I kid you not, $12. You can't find any less than $12. Of course, it's a roll of whatever, 4. But so you're talking about $3 a roll, right? Plus taxes. It's a ridiculous scenario right now. It's a ridiculous scenario. So on that note, I think with the toilet paper conclusion, right? And I see some people saying they buy 3-ply, which I don't blame you. I probably should too. Although I live in the hood, so I haven't seen any 3-ply. I don't see it in the pharmacies. I don't see it in the grocery stores. So some people are saying flushable baby wipes. Thought about that. I have a lot of friends who do that. All right, guys. Before you go, all right, we're hitting on hour 2. Hour 2. Like the video, okay? Before you go, like. All right. While you're at it, you should like it on Rockfin. I'm actually going to share the Rockfin stream. If you're on Rockfin, go on there, subscribe to the channel, like that video, help build my Rockfin. Would really appreciate it. Definitely want people to be supporting those. You never know. I never know when I'm going to be gone, guys. This isn't a guarantee. Having people on like Scott Ritter, just the things I say on here about Ukraine, about Russia, about China, about Iran, whatever. This isn't safe stuff. Let me show you something. I was showing some folks this afternoon before I go. So I'm getting carried away now here. So stick around. I was about to go after talking about toilet paper. But I got to show you this, all right? This is important. I kid you not. So I covered here. I've been censored on Twitter before. So on Twitter, my handle at Spirit of HO. You can find that also in my channel banner. I kid you not, guys. Everybody. I'm going to show you the email. Now, you'll see a number 12 on there because I've received that number of emails since like August saying that I've been reported. So in the last 3 months alone, I've been reported 12 times. So on Twitter, I have 2 strikes. Okay. At least that's how I view it. The first strike, I didn't lose any access, but I was told I had to delete the tweet. The second strike had to do with my comments on the Tiananmen Square incident anniversary. That post was reported, and I was locked out for 12 hours, and I couldn't do anything on my Twitter for 12 hours except for DM, and they made me delete the tweet, or they wouldn't give me my account back. So the 12 hours was contingent upon me deleting the tweet. So I believe that the next successful report, and it said it in the notice when it said I was locked out, the next report would likely lead to my removal from Twitter. That's why I'm also on Telegram, which I will also put in the chat, but it's also in my link tree in the channel banner, as well as a link tree in the description of this video. And now it's in the chat. So follow me on Telegram, where I also post updates, free updates. None of my content is monetized, even though I monetize a lot of my content. All right. So, like, I mean, none of my content is paywalled, even though I monetize my content. That's what I meant to say. So I want to show you this. I want to share my screen because today I received an interesting email. Okay. 10 a.m., about 9:54. Now I'm going to share my screen. And it says present screen. I want to share. Okay. I guess they changed it from sharing screen to presenting screen. Interesting. So I received this email. Am I able to? Okay. I don't know why I can't. There we go. No, that's even worse. Man, Proton Mail can be so clunky. All right. I just want to make this bigger and make. All right. There we go. So here I received this email, 9:54 a.m. This was today. If you really want all the details, Tuesday, October 4th. There you go. So I received this email. Hello. And this, I received so many of these. See, it says 12 here. I deleted some of them, but here you see since August, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is my 6th report since August. So basically two a month. All right, on Twitter. And here's what they said. Twitter is required by German law to provide notice to any users who are reported by people from Germany via the Network Enforcement Act reporting flow. We have received a complaint regarding your account at Spirit of HO for the following content. And then look at all these tweets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 tweets. 10 tweets of mine were, it seems like, mass reported. It seems like somebody, right? We know about Twitter's allegiance with ASBI, intelligence agencies. We know that Twitter is a big tech surveillance apparatus, just like all social media in the United States is. We know that it's corporate funded, just like all these corporations. They work with the government to silence voices they don't like. 10 tweets of mine. Let's see what some of the content is here. Could it be that Nazis in Ukraine trends on this app every other day because there's, in fact, a lot of Nazis in Ukraine being protected by the West? Just a thought. Say Nazi and forget about it. Here's the tweet. So I said, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said, "We are at war with Ukraine, but you are not at war with Ukraine, but the collective West." He's right. NATO has placed the world at the brink. So these are the tweets that I'm getting reported for. All right. U.S. sanctions on Venezuela killed 10,000 people in 2 years. Biden administration, why is communism causing migration? So these are what I'm getting, right? The U.S. has waged dozens of coups and killed thousands by way of sanctions in Latin America over the last decade, but Tucker Carlson thinks the U.S. is no longer enforcing the Monroe Doctrine and that we should worry about China. So these are my tweets. This is what I talk about. I talk about U.S. hypocrisy, talk about U.S. imperialism. That's what I talk about, mostly foreign policy. The attacks on both Nord Stream pipelines is an obvious act of sabotage, no matter what the United States says. Winter is coming, and the U.S. is using its proxy war on Russia to sink Europe deeper into full privatization and subservience to U.S. imperial diktats. I mean, I want to know where the lie is, but these are tweets that are getting reported. Now, whatever you think, you could disagree with my takes, but I'm getting mass reported, and one day it means I'm going to be gone. So subscribe to my Telegram for free, right? At Danny Haifong. I put the link in the chat earlier. It's also in my link tree, channel banner, and description. Make sure you're doing that because look, I may not have much time on Twitter or any of these platforms. That's just the truth of it. The special military operation changed everything. All right. It changed everything about censorship. Things that were already happening got a lot worse. A lot worse. So I'm not going to read all these tweets, but 10 of them. Okay. 10 of them. A new report was received, they say. Right. So that's what's happening to me. So that's why I say subscribe to my Telegram. That's why I say support my work, because your support is what sustains this programming. It's what sustains my writing and my journalism. I do this. I basically do this on a full-time basis, even though I still work part-time. I still have to work part-time. It's why I try to continuously increase my goals economically, financially, because I'm trying to scale back on that. But I am still working full-time. So please do, support this work. Here's how you can do it. And then I'm going to leave all of you for the night. Okay. Number one, you are all here. You can like this video. You can share this video. So you can subscribe to the channel. So you hit the notifications bell. So you get notified about when I go live, when I post videos. You can become a member of this channel, right? For $4.99 per month. You can become a member on Patreon and on Substack. Substack is for yearly subscriptions. Patreon is for monthly subscriptions. Those are the two best ways to support the work. You can, of course, leave super chats here. That's amazing as well. Super thanks on videos, right? There's so many ways you can support monetarily. And then elsewhere, right, the biggest way you can support me elsewhere outside of this is, of course, sharing my work, following me everywhere, subscribing to this channel, but also making sure that you are going on Rockfin and subscribing there if you are, in fact, on Rockfin. If you are on Odyssey, right, I'm also on Odyssey, and I should really be sharing that more, but I will share that with you now. Okay. But you should definitely be hitting up there, making sure that you're following there. It's in the chat now. You should be following me, of course, on Twitter and all of that, but going to my Linktree wherever you find my work, it's all there on Linktree. So hit that link and go through it. Follow me on Twitter, of course, while I'm still there. But Telegram is really the most important place, because that will be my backup. That's where I'll be permanently should Twitter get rid of me. All right. And I just want to thank this last super chat here from Zelfo CZ. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. That's it. That's it for me. Great show tonight. Much thanks, of course, to Scott Ritter for coming on the program. I'm sure I'll have him on again as things develop. I could be on tomorrow, but I may be on Callin. That's another place where you can follow my work. I have a podcast called Cold War Brew. I'm contemplating taking the night off from streaming and doing. I need to continue to do my podcast there, because I am on contract with Callin. So I'm probably going to be on there tomorrow. So Callin Cold War Brew. Okay, that's in the chat now. It's also in my Linktree, I believe, as well. So you can, get on Callin, download that app onto your phone. I have podcasts on there. It's all about the new Cold War, on China, on Russia. I focus on that, U.S. foreign policy, U.S. imperialism, breaking it down, what it means. And you can follow me there and make sure you're subscribing to that podcast. And I should be on there tomorrow. All right. That's all, everyone. Thank you so much. Take good care. And before you go, all right, we're almost, I think we've hit it. We have 1.1 thousand likes. Let's get it to 1.2 before you go, because there's still 1,200 people there. So like the video before you go. Red salute. Bye-bye, everybody.